Welcome to Hydrogen Rising, a bi-weekly podcast created and hosted by the global law firm K&L Gates that brings you analysis of critical, cutting-edge issues impacting the global hydrogen market. We look forward to your engagement and feedback. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out if you have ideas about new topics you'd like us to cover.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Hydrogen Rising. I'm Sandi Safro, and I'll be your host for today's episode, in which we're going to discuss what France is doing in the hydrogen sector. For those who have been following, we recently released a new chapter of the Hydrogen Handbook that, as is apropos for today's episode, covers France. Here with me today to talk more about France's plans and recent developments are the two authors of that chapter, Mélanie Bruneau and Antoine de Rohan Chabot. Mélanie is a partner in our Brussels office and focuses her practice on European law with a particular emphasis on regulatory compliance, EU competition law, and a variety of corporate and commercial agreements. Antoine is a senior associate also in our Brussels office and focuses his practice on EU regulatory matters, including transportation and energy, logistics, e-commerce and cross-border issues, and EU and French compliance programs. Mélanie and Antoine, welcome to the podcast. It's so great to have you both here today. Just a bit of background on France before we get started. France has been a leader of sorts in the development of a hydrogen economy at scale. The country was one of the first to announce a national hydrogen strategy. It has also committed significant funds towards the growth of a hydrogen economy and is home to several companies that are taking on major roles when it comes to hydrogen. This includes Total and Engie, who announced earlier this year that they plan to develop the Mas Hylia project, which will be France's largest green hydrogen production facility and is planned to include several unique and innovative features. It is definitely worth checking out and watching. As we'll talk more about, France is also taking real steps to integrate hydrogen into its transportation sector. But before we get into all of that, I'd like to start with some level setting. Mélanie, can you start us off by talking at a high level about France's national hydrogen strategy and its three main goals?
Thank you, Sandi, for the introduction and the invitation to participate in this podcast. Well, the French government presented the national strategy for the development of carbon-free hydrogen last September. It follows three main objectives, including decarbonizing the industry, developing hydrogen mobility, and building a competitive French electrolysis sector. To do that, the French state is planning to grant 7.2 billion euros in aid. This includes 2 billion euros over the next 2 years, 3.4 billion euros by 2023, and 1.8 billion until 2030. So when it comes to these objectives, let's talk about decarbonizing the industry. This involves installing electrolyzers to make a significant contribution to the decarbonization of the economy. This will be possible thanks to the installation of a 6.5 gigawatt green hydrogen production capacity via electrolysis. When it comes to developing hydrogen mobility, this means that in parallel with an initial phase of conversion of land passenger and freight transport to hydrogen technologies, notably commercial vehicles or heavy goods vehicles, buses, hydrogen-powered trains, the development of key technologies will continue through pilot projects for hydrogen-powered river shuttles and ships, as well as the acceleration of innovation efforts in favor of a decarbonized hydrogen-powered aircraft, which could actually enter into service in the 2030s. The goal is to save more than 6 million tons of CO2 in 2030. And finally, when it comes to building a competitive French electrolysis sector, this means installing 6.5 gigawatts of electrolyzers by 2030 to produce 600,000 tons of carbon-free hydrogen. The objective is to generate between 50,000 and 150,000 direct and indirect green jobs in France.
That is really, really major goal, and really good to see France taking that on, and also really, really pleased to see the level of job creation that is anticipated and part of the goal there. I know we go into some detail in the Hydrogen Handbook about France's energy law. Can you also talk a little bit about how the energy law interplays with the national hydrogen strategy and what some of the more critical provisions are of the energy law that folks should be paying attention to?
Sure. Hydrogen deployment in France is mainly governed by the Energy Law of 8 November 2019 on energy and climate. In accordance with the objectives of Article 1 of the Energy Law, 20 to 40% of French consumption of hydrogen by 2030 will have to come from a source renewable or low carbon. In particular, Article 49 of the Energy Law guarantees the right of access to natural gas facilities to low carbon hydrogen producers. This right of access covers gas transmission and distribution facilities and LNG installations, and is also guaranteed subject to preserving the proper operation and safety of the infrastructure. In addition, Article 52 authorizes the French government to enact ordinances to define the terminology for different types of hydrogen, to define a support framework for low-carbon hydrogen, and to allow for the production, transportation, storage, and traceability of hydrogens as well. A system of guarantees of origin is also planned for green hydrogen. In addition to the energy law, it's also worth noting that after a long journey disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, the climate law entitled Climate and Resilience was presented on 10 February 2021 to the Council of Ministers. Right after that, on March 1st, before the Special Committee of the National Assembly on the Climate and Resilience Bill, the Minister of the Economy, Bruneau, recalled that the French state was going to invest 7 billion euros to develop carbon-free hydrogen by 2030. He insisted on the fact that it was necessary to ensure that the value chain works well in France, while defending the idea that it is essential to keep a long enough adaptation period in terms of ecological transition so as not to favor large companies to the detriment of medium-sized companies or SMEs.
Thank you, Mélanie. Yeah, the question of development of a value chain for hydrogen is an issue that we've talked a lot about in prior episodes, and something that our regular listeners will be very familiar with. There is an aspect of what you talked about that touches on an issue in the value chain that I want to dig in a little bit more on. France recently issued a hydrogen ordinance that covers three main areas, one of which really caught my attention because it focuses on an issue that we face in other areas of the energy sector for a variety of different reasons, and that issue is traceability. Those in the liquefied natural gas or LNG sector may already be familiar with this issue, but for those who aren't, traceability is, as the term suggests, a question of tracing a molecule back to its source or back to its point of production. For LNG, this can become an issue if, for example, a regulator wants to know where LNG that was produced in its country ultimately is delivered, which is a question that the US Department of Energy has focused on. This might sound like it's a pretty easy task, but it can become quite challenging when you have molecules that are fungible, meaning each molecule is essentially the same as any other. And if on top of the fungibility issue, you also have molecules from multiple sources that are commingled in the same tank. At that point, if you want to find your specific molecule, you can think of it like trying to play Where's Waldo, except everybody in the picture is going to be Waldo. So this issue arises for hydrogen because hydrogen is essentially a fungible molecule as well. But different values are going to be placed on hydrogen depending upon how the hydrogen was produced and the attendant carbon footprint. So, for example, green hydrogen is being viewed differently from a commercial and maybe also an ESG or sustainability perspective than, say, gray or even blue hydrogen. So, with all of that said, back to the question. As I mentioned, France's recent hydrogen ordinance included some language around certificates of origin and traceability. Can you tell our listeners more about that and what we might expect to see?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Sandy. And you're right. The French Hydrogen Ordinance, which was adopted quite recently in March 2021, addresses this central issue of traceability. And the first step to do that is that the Hydrogen Ordinance starts by creating the categories that we are supposed to trace. And those categories are three different categories of hydrogen: renewable hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen, and carbonated hydrogen. So we don't use colors, but green hydrogen was the label that was used at first, but it was deemed that a more specific difference was needed. So what the ordinance does is that it creates a two-tier system in order to ensure traceability. The first being a guarantee of origin, and this concerns renewable and low carbon hydrogen that may be in the future be mixed with hydrogen from different sources between the production and the consumption stage. So this mechanism, which is still general for now, we can expect different or more specific developments on that at a later stage. So this first guarantee of origin will allow to know where the hydrogen comes from when it's mixed at some point during the production to consumer stage. The second mechanism is a guarantee of traceability, which you mentioned, and that's when hydrogen is not mixed with another type of hydrogen, so it remains sort of the way it was when it was produced, and that can be transferred when it's produced. So the way it works, or it will work rather, is that the guarantee of traceability will make it possible to prove that a certain quantity of hydrogen that was physically delivered to a buyer or a consumer is either renewable or low carbon. That's the main point, as those terms are defined in the ordinance, obviously. And the guarantee of origin will make it possible to certify to the buyer or to the consumer that among the quantity of hydrogen that he or she received, the proportion of which was either renewable or low carbon. So that goes to what you addressed. Here I'm talking about buyer-consumer, but that can definitely be used also as a justification in case of a regulatory investigation. This definitely will allow to identify. And I want to mention also the guarantee of origin. It can be issued completely independently of quantity, whereas the guarantee of traceability will be dependent on the quantity of hydrogen produced. And it stays with the guarantee of traceability, which says that you produced X tons of hydrogen, and this goes together. This means, of course, that the issuance of a guarantee of traceability will be more constraining for producers than simple guarantee of origin. And in that regard, the hydrogen ordinance provides that there can be conversion mechanisms between guarantees of origin and guarantees of traceability. So this will allow for more flexibility in the system. And both guarantees will be valid from the date of the end of production. So it's limited in time. We're still in a process of building this scheme, which, as you mentioned, exists for other types of energy, notably LNG. What we know from what the hydrogen ordinance tells us is that this whole system of guarantees will be managed by a dedicated organization. There is already a system in France for other types of renewable energy, so this will be, we assume, duplicated one way or another to hydrogen specifically. But this will be designated after a competitive bidding process, and we'll see. Obviously, this is a development that we'll be monitoring in the coming months to see what exactly is set up. And I'm mentioning that obviously there will be developments because we've been informed that a more specific traceability decree will be probably enacted in the coming months. It says first semester of 2021, which we're not at the end of, but given the circumstances, maybe it will be later. We don't know, but we can definitely expect more specific developments in that area to better explain how it will work. And one final note is that this traceability guarantees of origin system will fit together with the guarantees of origin, which will be, we assume, issued in other EU countries in line with a European directive, which is the regulation, which is the regulation of 11 December 2018 on the promotion of use of renewable sources. So that's where we are on this subject.
That's great. Thank you, Antoine. And just to make sure that I understand fully, so the guarantee of origin sounds like it is meant to address a situation where you could have commingling of hydrogen that was produced using various methods and maybe results in some renewable hydrogen and some low carbon hydrogen, whereas the guarantee of traceability is really intended to be used and perhaps for practical reasons could only be used when the hydrogen is not mixed, because that's really the only way that you could actually fully guarantee what the production pathway is. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right. One is destined to identify a certain type of hydrogen within a mix, And the other is definitely meant to identify a quantity of hydrogen which is of only one type and will not be mixed.
Okay, that's really helpful. That's very interesting. And I think it will be really fascinating to see how that system evolves in France. It may be very helpful for other countries and other regions as they look to set up their own certificates of origin and traceability systems. With all of that, I guess as we look ahead, what other topics do you all think France will address or perhaps needs to address in future ordinances or other regulations to help facilitate hydrogen at scale?
Well, setting up of national, regional, and industry stakeholders governance dedicated to scaling up hydrogen in France will be required at some point and may involve a mix in terms of organization. We can possibly think of an hydrogen state secretariat or a public-private agency. It could also involve a high commission for planning department, which would be responsible for the strategic vision and coordination deployment over time. There are and will also be consortia of actors to develop projects and cover the risk, as well as state agency with de-risking tools. We could certainly also mention coordination of financial actors involving notably the European Investment Bank or the Bank of Territories in conjunction with private banks. And at the same time, coordination of deployment at regional and local level will be necessary as well.
Thank you, Mélanie. I think you touched on something in your response that is also a question that I wanted to ask. We've talked in prior podcast episodes about the importance of funding, particularly for early stages of development of hydrogen at scale. And I'd be curious what types of funding and support you're seeing France provide in order to support the goals in its strategy.
Absolutely, Sandi, this is true. As in most things, the funding is fundamental. And as you mentioned, especially since we're only starting or we're trying to build a value chain around hydrogen, which doesn't currently exist. So we, and France being France, we can obviously expect a lot of public funding. Mélanie mentioned the 7 billion euros that the French government intends to invest in hydrogen projects. And the way the government arrived at this amount is that it started in early 2020 by launching a call for expression of interest, which basically said that it invited all kinds of stakeholders to come up with projects and to submit them to the government in order for the government to assess what kind of level of investment would be necessary and what kind of obstacles would be faced by those projects, technical, regulatory, and financial obstacles, with the end goal being the emergence of a sustainable hydrogen value chain. This is where the 7 billion came, although the call for expression of interest received projects over 160 applications, which totaled over 32 billion. In theory, obviously, that's not the amount that the government was planning to invest. So they'll get 7 billion, which is already nice. And there's no single source for this money. Some of which, maybe a lot of which, will come from the French agency that's dedicated to this subject. That is the French Agency for Ecological Transition, which in French is ADEME. And they currently have two, or at least they've launched in 2020, and those projects are still ongoing, by the way. 2 projects that are related to hydrogen. The first one is a project that's called Technological Bricks and Demonstrators. And this project targets companies that want to develop or improve components and systems related to production and transportation of hydrogen and its subsequent use, notably, for example, to design and develop new vehicles, and in particular for road or rail transportation. So that's the first project. This project has a 350 million euros funding, and for the next 2 years, it's still open for applications. So interested parties may still want to check it out. Their second ongoing project is one called Territorial Hydrogen Ecosystems. And by territorial, we mean in France, whatever is not done at the national level. So local governments, basically. And this project is meant to bring together local authorities and also local industrial providers in order to create a project around hydrogen, especially around industry and mobility, so transport and industry. They want is to produce a lot of economies of scale And this project is also running until 2023 with a funding of 275 million euros. And for this, they're expecting a last round of applications to close on 14 September 2021. So this is also a project that's still open for applications. That's one source of funding. Another source of funding, which to my knowledge has not been allocated to a specific agency, but in late 2020, the French government also announced a big R&D project to support the industrialization of electrolyzers to produce and deploy green hydrogen. I mean, it was called green hydrogen. Now it's a bit more specific, as I mentioned, given the ordinance. Part of this project might also involve the creation of a gigafactory electrolyzer project and industrialization of other technological building blocks. I mean, fuel cells, storage tanks, materials. All of these being part of an integrated hydrogen economy at the European level. So this is also upcoming. We don't have a lot of details. But what we know is that this is going to be funded to the tune of around 1.5 billion euros by the French government. And finally, I want to mention that the hydrogen ordinance, which we talked about, also created a specific funding scheme for hydrogen projects. But this one is a bit more specific because it only consists in supporting production of renewable or low-carbon hydrogen by water electrolysis, which is the technology that the government seems to be favoring. So it's the type of technology that the government wants to encourage. The ordinance only created the framework so far. We'll see further details down the line. But the general idea is that this is going to be a support scheme that's open to any person or company established in a member state of the European Union or the European Economic Area with an intent to operate or build and operate a hydrogen production unit in France. So obviously you can be based in another member state, but the production unit has to be based in France. And the idea there, I mean, that's not a surprise. The project will be selected after a competitive process with a first an eligibility phase. Are you eligible? And then there's going to be a designation of beneficiaries based on individual examination of projects, on their economic profitability, or at least planned profitability, and also in relation to its overall greenhouse gas emissions and contribution to the national environmental objectives. So this is also something that we can look forward to. It's going to be in the form of either operating aid or a combination of financial aid and for investment and operating aid. We'll see. It can be a mix of those two. And there's going to be a contract signed with the French state to materialize all of that. So this is, again, only a framework. We'll see how it checks out in the coming months.
I guess just one last question, because I see we're running a bit up against our normal podcast time. You both mentioned that transportation is a priority in France's national strategy, and we've seen that reflected in a number of other countries as well. And given that many modes of transportation are among the hardest to abate sectors and the benefits of using hydrogen fuel cells versus a battery in certain applications, I think this makes a lot of sense. I'd be curious what areas of the transportation sector France is particularly focused on.
Thanks, Sandy. Well, there are several areas in the transportation sector which are interesting to mention, and I'll do that briefly, if that's okay. On 8 April 2021, there was the first order of dual-mode electric hydrogen trains, which was made. SNCF Voyageurs has placed this order with train manufacturer Alstom for the first 12 dual-mode electric hydrogen trains. The order, worth a total of almost 190 million euros, represents a significant step in rail transport reduction of CO2 emissions for the benefit of passengers and regions as well. Another project worth mentioning involves Safra and Symbio, a subsidiary of Michelin and Faurecia. They have signed a contract for the development of 1,500 buses equipped with an optimized hydrogen system and a range of services adapted to the use of these vehicles, which are expected to be available by the end of 2021. And as I mentioned as well, we'll see a number of consortia to develop in this area. One of them is iTrucks Europe. It was created to build the European clean heavy-duty transport industry. And its purpose is really to lower CO2 emissions in heavy-duty transport sector, to help reach GHG objectives in 2030, and to shift from diesel to hydrogen. So as you can see, I mean, this is really just a little illustration of what we're starting to see in the transport sector, which we will continue to closely monitor.
That's great. Thank you, Mélanie. There's really, truly so much that I'd love to talk with you both about and dig into on France and its strategy and the development of a hydrogen economy. But I think we can stop ourselves here for today and maybe do a follow-up episode with both of you in a few months to continue the conversation. So Mélanie and Antoine, thank you both so much for your time today. It was really, really a pleasure to have you.
Thank you
very much, Sandy.
And thank you also, as always, to our listeners who are now tuning in from all around the world. Please share this podcast with any friends and colleagues that you have who are interested in hydrogen and following developments. You can find this episode and our prior episodes on the K&L Gates website, which is klgates.com/hydrogen, as well as on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to hit subscribe. And if you like what you hear, don't be shy about giving us 5 stars. If there are any topics that you'd like to hear us discuss, please send them to me or to my co-host, David Wachner. And just 2 more things. Keep your eyes out for a new chapter of the Hydrogen Handbook, which will be released shortly. And if you have any questions about what we discussed on today's episode, please reach out to me, to Mélanie, or to Antoine. We'd love to hear from you. With all of that, thank you again for listening, and we'll be back with a new episode of Hydrogen Rising in just 2 weeks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hydrogen Rising. Be sure to subscribe to receive timely notifications of future episodes and check out our market-leading publication, the Hydrogen Handbook, on our website at www.klgates.com.